Are being recorded.
They are. Well, good morning, everybody online. We're on the next session. I don't think it's session 5 anymore.
No.
The next session of Creation, Evolution, and You. I got a theme song. So today what we're going to do, now that creation is finished, we're going to talk about what happened now that everything is in balance, everything is perfect the way that God wanted it to be. So we're talking about the 7th day and beyond. So for the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about two main things. One, what happened in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve sinned and brought sin into the world. And number two, what happened with the Great Flood and how did that change all of God's creation? Both of those things work together to make what we experience today what it is. And it's not just physical things where you can look at it and say, oh yeah, that must be different than the way God intended it. But there's also physical processes and chemical processes that changed because of that. So we're going to discuss some of those things. So before we get into the change, I need to let you into some of the chemistry that was going on. So of course now I'm speaking my language and going to talk about some of the things, the processes that were going on at the time of God's creation, and then that 7th day and beyond. So remember, everything that we're doing here is talking about all of the same things that scientists see, but scientists try to explain them by using processes that are in place today. And those processes are processes that have been changed because of the flood and because of the curse of sin on the universe. So the processes today are not the same as they were before the flood and before the fall. So that's one problem that they have with it. The second problem is that they try to explain everything in a natural way, not in a supernatural way. And of course, if God is involved, that makes it a supernatural process. So we're looking at the same thing, but we're looking at it from different viewpoints. We're looking at it from the viewpoint of God is the creator and put everything in motion. They're looking at it in terms of natural processes that require enough time to make the observable happen. And so that's the difference between creationism and evolution. Now we need to remember that at the end of each day of God's creation, and we've already established those are 1 day, 24-hour periods of creation, that God said, and this was good. Okay, so what that means is it met his specifications. It's everything that he set it out to be on that day. Everything matched his specifications and it was good. But then on the 6th day, after all of creation was finished, he said that all that he had made, so it wasn't just man that he declared as being very good on the 6th day. He says that it says that he looked at all that he had made. So all 6 days of creation. And he says it was very good. Now, what that establishes for us is a symbiosis. Okay, I love that word. It's a symbiotic relationship that exists between God's creation of day, night, earth, sea, plant life, sea life, avian life, mammalian life, all of the land dwellers, and all of this working together in the way that God had intended. Now that everything is working together, it is very good. A couple of things that we need to remember is that prior to the flood, there is no mention of rain. It did not rain. It specifically tells us in scripture that all of the plants of the earth and the trees were watered by the dew and by underground springs. There was no need for rain. So a lot of things had to change between the way that God had created things, saying that it was very good, and what we see today. So this term, very good, it implies that the whole of God's creation could not be more perfect. It also means that everything that he created was already a working cycle of biology. So that means at the same time, you would see great sequoia trees with all of their annual rings, even though it's only been 4 days, all of their annual rings. You will also see young trees, seedlings, saplings, and even pine cones.
So the thing, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
The answer is yes. For the same reason that you'd have trees full grown and pine cones, seeds, you will also have full grown chickens and chicks and eggs all at the same time as part of the cycle that is created in order to make it all very good. So if anybody asks you what came first, the chicken or the egg, you can say scripture tells us it was both at the same time, because that's the way that God created it all. It could not be more perfect. The perfection of creation that we see now, no longer perfect because of the curse of sin on the earth. So even the most beautiful pictures that I could find on the internet, they still pale in comparison to what God's creation was.
Things and it's like, man, that's so beautiful or so amazing, and that's not even a blip on the
Right.
radar of what it looks like.
Right. Absolutely right. So it says that the earth brought forth abundantly. So what's that implying?
That it just came through.
Reproduction is in full bloom here. Okay, so everything is reproducing after its kind. When I was doing some research yesterday, I found an implication that I had not thought of before. When God created man, and he told them to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. That was the command that was given, to fill the earth. You know what that implies? He intended it to be filled, which means there is a point at which it would be called filled.
Has to be.
So what happens after that? Because there's not supposed to be any death at this time. This is prior to the fall. So there's no death. So we're really getting into the realm of speculation at this point. Because if he intended it to be filled, that means at some point it would be filled. And at that point, since there's no death, it means reproduction has to shut off because the earth is filled. Kind of interesting. I had never thought of that before. But because of sin, because of the flood, we didn't get filled. So the earth is fully functional. The earth's ecosystems and all the physical relationships are in balance. They're in equilibrium. Plants and animals are created in every stage of growth and development. God's awesome creation. Stacy and I went through the Sequoia National Forest. How many of y'all have been through it? You got to go. Talking about putting something in your place to realize that these trees are so huge that you can drive a car through them.
And just standing next to them is you're minuscule. I
You,
mean,
you can't even fathom how small you are.
you're as big as a piece of bark.
Yeah, yeah, it's really amazing. So functional creation would have the appearance of age. In order for the trees to stand, they have to have growth rings. Those growth rings create the strong structure that's necessary for the tree to hold up its own weight. So that means these great sequoias would had to have been created with the rings in them. What do we do with those rings? We count them so that we can figure out how many growth seasons that they went through. So that means on day one, when God created them, he created them with hundreds and thousands of years already in them. Now that's an important point. And to drive it home a little further, he created Adam as a full-grown adult. He didn't create him as a baby that had to grow up. So he created Adam with age built in him already. Now you're going to see where I'm going with this as we start talking about some of the processes that were going on at the time. Can you give me water, please?
What's interesting is all the things that were created with age, but there was no death until the first two boys, and we have family issues.
Right.
There
Thank you.
was, consistent life to that point, but we already had it set up for seed time and harvest, so there was already that cycle set within,
Right.
life.
What I had to teach my students a lot in life science is that when the trees lose their leaves in the fall, they aren't dead. And so, most kids think that when the trees aren't green anymore and they lose their leaves, that they died. And then they magically come back to life again in the spring. But that's a process that's necessary. And that's part of the system that God put in place, not only to stimulate the proper growth in the tree, but also to provide nutrition for the undergrowth that's underneath it. So all of it's part of that cycle that God created. So in Genesis 2, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. And by the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Completed means to stop when something's accomplished. So it means he set out a task, he performed his task to completion, and it was finished. Okay, check mark, done. Okay, and rested means that God did no work on the seventh day. That means he was not creating anything else. He wasn't spurring anything along. He wasn't winding up the great watch spring of the universe in order to keep it going. Basically, he stepped back and he just admired everything that had been created. And in that, he probably just reveled in his handiwork. And it's okay to do that. There's no pride. There's not the sinful kind of pride that's in that. It's just that satisfaction of knowing a job well done. It's that big collective at the end when everything is just right and just perfect. Okay. So then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. So remember, those are churchy words. What do they mean? To sanctify something, what does that mean? You can use another churchy word. Okay, to make it holy, which means to set it apart. And to set it apart just means make it different from the rest of the days of the week. Just make it different. And so I was trying to explain this to somebody this week, that a Sabbath doesn't mean you have to, wake up at 10:30 in the morning on Sunday and do absolutely nothing but drink beer all day, and then wake up on Monday morning and go back to work. That's not what it was intended to do. And there are some people that have to work on Sundays. Does that mean that they're sinning? No, there's a couple of ways.
Sabbath has something to do with the moon, doesn't it? It's lunar Sabbath, and it really doesn't have to do with the day of the week.
So a Sabbath can be treated like a tithe. It is a portion that's supposed to be dedicated to God. So the New Testament Sabbath is a little bit different than the Old Testament Sabbath. The Old Testament Sabbath had to do with sunrise, sunset on a particular, on a particular day of the week. So Friday at sunset to Saturday at sunset was their Sabbath. Okay. Different for us as Christians because we moved our Sabbath to be the day that the Lord raised himself from the dead on Sunday. So we just made our Sabbath to be Sunday. But a Sabbath in the New Testament is not bound to a calendar. It's not bound to a clock. A Sabbath, a New Testament Sabbath for a believer just means a day in your week that you can dedicate your thoughts, your mind, your emotion to God. It's a time where you're supposed to reflect on God. So that does not mean a time that you can go out and party all day, or a time that you're just a couch potato and watching television all day. It does need to be something productive for the furthering of God's kingdom and the furthering of your spirituality within his kingdom. That's what that Sabbath is supposed to be. You're supposed to keep from doing things that would distract you from God. Okay, so does that mean somebody's sinning if they go fishing on Sabbath? Some people can really find a closeness with God in nature. I'm not one of those people, so that wouldn't work for me. That's too much work. But there's people that can really connect with God when they're out in the middle of the water somewhere. And you do what you need to do in order to connect with God better. So he rested from all his work, which God had created and made. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. So this is one of those situations where day in the same passage is used two different ways. In verse 3, the seventh day, that means that 24-hour period from the time after he created man on day 6 and then day 8 when he created Texas. So the other day, that's not true. Okay.
There's a song about it, so it has to be.
So down here in verse 4, it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made earth and heaven. So that means in this period of time that God created. So in this case, this day actually means a week. And this is the same day that we see used in Daniel later on. So there's some times that it's a few times, but there's some times that a day actually does not mean a 24-hour period. But isn't it cool how Moses, at the prompting of the Spirit, when he wrote down the creation days, he specified, and there was evening and there was morning, in order to avoid any kind of confusion that might be there.
Is that the same word?
They use it the same word, but it's a contextual clue in the Hebrew language that doesn't necessarily get translated over well. So in the days of yore, how we might use that word in Middle English. It doesn't mean, 1 day, 2 days, 5 days. It means just during this time that we're talking about. So yeah, contextual clues is what helps here. All right. So a couple of things, the characteristics of the pre-fall world, the land area, so Pangea, because we still agree that that's what it's called today, had a much, much larger visible landmass than today. Why can we say that? The water was still under the ground. Okay, so the water wasn't above the ground like it was after the flood. So
But there were lakes and rivers and seas.
there were lakes and seas and springs, but not rivers. We get a special 4 rivers that were created, and we don't know where the source of those were, because rivers are caused either from snow melt rainfall or springs. So most likely the 4 rivers that are mentioned flowing into the Garden of Eden, those would have had to have been spring fed. Because remember, there's no rain at this point,
Is that FORE or FOUR?
FOUR. And they're named specifically. Only 2 of them are known today that we can know where they were, Euphrates and Tigris. The other 2 rivers, those names don't exist anymore. So we don't know where those rivers were prior to the flood. So there was an abundance of food. God had created all the plants, and he told Adam and Eve in the garden that they were to eat of all of the plants, all of the trees, except for the tree of knowledge of sin and evil. Okay, which means they were also supposed to eat from the tree of life. That wasn't forbidden. One of the authors that I was reading suggested that the tree of life was necessary to eat from so that they could live forever. But that falls, because if God intended the earth to be full, there wouldn't be enough tree of life to go around. And traveling to get there would be problematic. So, but it was an interesting idea. So there was a balanced environment. So how old is the earth? Thousands of years, millions of years, billions of years. In the eyes of science, the earth is billions of years old. Some will argue that it's only millions of years old. But scripture tells us that it's just thousands of years old. Around 8 to 10,000 years old. And that kind of blows everybody's mind, because what have you been indoctrinated with all your life? Dinosaurs are millions of years old. And so how can you have an earth that is only roughly 10,000 years old if dinosaurs are millions of years old? So that's some of the stuff that we need to talk about. The biggest thing is what's called radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is really cool. They take radioactive elements and they measure how much you start with, and then after a period of time, how much you're left with. And that rate of decay is called half-life. Okay, so that's the amount of time. If you started off with a pound of uranium, how much time would it have to decay into other elements until you only had a half a pound of uranium remaining? Half-life. So they can measure, knowing the half-life, how old something is based on how much of the daughter elements, the stuff that it turned into, remains in comparison with how much of the parent element you start with. So different methods that they use include uranium, thorium, rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon, and then the one that everybody knows the most, carbon-14 dating. So each of these elements and each of these methods have a half-life, which tells you how long it takes to end up with half of what you started with, and then a specific type of decay that it undergoes. So everything is talked about in terms of their radioactive elements. So like uranium, 238. They use that top number that's above uranium. Polonium, 214. Krypton, 89. Radon, 222. So the top number. Pardon me?
Superman.
It's still an element.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know. Continue.
Yep. And then each of these radioactive elements have a half-life, where we've got uranium, which has a half-life of 4.47 billion with a B, billion years. Or we've got polonium, which has a half-life of one or 1600 thousandths of a second.
1,600 thousandths of a second.
Yeah. So each of these different elements have different decay rates. Based on their decay rates, you can start making some measurements. Different kinds of decay. You can see decay mode over here. Got alpha, gamma, beta. So 3 different types of radiation that you can get during this decay. And each of those things can be measured. The most popular one to measure, because it's the easiest, is alpha. Alpha particles are actually helium atoms. They're big. A gamma ray is so small you can't even, you can't catch one. Okay.
And it turns you into the Hulk.
And turns you into the Hulk, right? So to measure the age of the Earth using natural processes, you have to establish a clocking principle, something that you can use to take the measurements with. So in order to have a clocking principle, you have to have an initial and a final calibration, and you have to have a consistent rate of change. Now, I'm going to talk about this in terms of using a candle, because that's something that we've all got experience with. It's something that we all have seen, okay? So I'm going to make it really easy for you. So here's a candle that's 6 inches tall. It's burning. It burns at a rate of 1 inch per hour, okay? So you can measure that, okay? You can measure with the ruler how tall the candle is, and you can measure after an hour to see how much it changed. So that's easy to measure. So how long has the candle been burning? We got a problem
How
now
tall was it?
because you don't know how tall it was. That's a huge problem when it comes to radiometric dating. We know the rate of decay, that's the burn rate. We also know how much of the element exists right now, how tall the candle is. But the problem is we don't know how much of the element existed at the beginning. We don't know how tall the candle is. The first time radiometric dating was used to measure the age of rocks, they had to set 2 points in time. One now, and the other was a known number in the past. There was no known number in the past. So they basically picked up a rock out of the backyard and said, this is 1 million years old.
Oh my gosh.
And that's how those first measurements were taken.
They do math like me.
You have to have 2 known points in order to draw a line between them.
And what year was this?
That was the 1930s.
Oh.
So we have another problem though. They've found out since that time that the rate of burn, the rate of decay changes. What happens if you have a breeze blowing on the candle? Burns faster.
You use more oxygen and burns quicker.
Yep, more oxygen available makes it burn quicker. They're finding out the same thing with the decay rates. Under different conditions, these decay rates that are supposed to be constants aren't so constant. So now we run into
They've
problems.
also been able to manipulate wood to make it petrify.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about that just a little bit at the end of today.
About Mount St. Helens.
Mount St. Helens, absolutely.
You know, we didn't go there and we were in Seattle.
I know it. We were close. We flew over it.
I know.
So radioactive decay. So this one is what I was talking about. So you can have uranium-238, which is the radioactive uranium. And when it decays, it kicks off an alpha particle, which is what I told you was helium. Okay, kicks off a helium. And after kicking off 8 heliums, the uranium turns into lead-207. That's part of the radioactive decay process. And so by measuring the amount of uranium that you have and the amount of lead that you have, they would do their fancy math to figure out using half-life, how much uranium did we start with and how long did it take to get back to there. So very, very simply, that's how radiometric dating works. Okay. You having flashbacks?
I said, I must have missed that day.
All right, so in radiometric dating, it's assumed that all of the daughter compound, lead in this case, was formed from uranium decay. So if we see any lead in there, we're assuming that all of it came from the decay of uranium. That's another bad assumption,
I was like, couldn't it be, okay, go ahead.
because you could have some to start with. God created it that way. Remember, he created things with age in them already. So even if the radiometric dating process is right, who's to say that God didn't already put 4.5 million years in this particular rock? But I can prove it wrong in other ways. So this assumption's not verifiable, and therefore it must be held in faith. Scientists have to have
What?
faith also. In a functional, balanced universe, elements would be expected to be naturally distributed in most rock. So you'd have all sorts of different elements there, not just a chunk of uranium sitting there in a bubble all by itself. So calibration, we got a problem. So we've talked about the candle burning over time, and that would give us a burn. We can use a burn rate that we can measure. And if we knew that all of the candles in the drawer started out at 6 inches and it's 3 inches now, well, we know it burned for 3 hours,
Right.
roughly. Okay, we can do that with the candle as long as we've got more candles to compare it to. We don't have that when we talk about the elements that are found in the earth. We've got no fresh creation. And if they try to measure fresh creation like molten lava, it really doesn't work. It messes up everything. Well, even after it
Well,
cools.
maybe that's because they're wrong.
So a rate without a measured calibration can only give an apparent age based on an assumption about the initial conditions. A lot of assuming going on. So uranium and other radioactive compounds are slightly soluble in water, and they can leach out from the mineral deposits. So that means the uranium that they're measuring isn't all the uranium that started out there, because some of it's already come out. And the radioactive decay rates have been shown to vary over time. So we've got inaccurate readings that happen all the time. And science knows it, which is why when samples are sent in, the person that found the sample has to tell them what kind of rock did it come from, and we think it's between 3 and 4 million years old. They've already biased the test by giving what they think the age might be. We had several things wrong. Every one of the natural phenomenon previously mentioned results in an increase in the apparent age measured. If you've got one error in there, that could be just a little off. If you have 2 errors in there, it doesn't make it twice as off. It compounds it and makes it multiple times off. 3 different kinds of errors. Now we're talking a factor of 1,000. 4, a factor of 10,000. So all of these different kinds of errors, they multiply exponentially on the apparent age of whatever it is that they're trying to measure. Let's go back to the Grand Canyon. So using rate study, they analyzed 7 samples of metamorphic rock from the Brahma schist, which is actually underneath the Zoroaster granite and the Vishnu schist. So it's the deepest area that they can even get to in the Grand Canyon. The isochron age, which is what they call in millions of years, how old the rock is, and they call it MA for short, for mega annum, millions of years. It was determined by 2 alpha decay based radiometric methods. They used uranium and they used samarium, and 1 beta decay method, which was rubidium, hoping these 3 different methods, 3 different labs would come up with the same number. Not even close. Uranium came up to 1.8 billion years. Sumerian came up to 1.6 billion years, and rubidium came up with 1.2 million years.
Well, that's a little bit different.
A factor of 10,000 different between them. So the alpha decay methods gave a much older range of age than the beta method. The highest was 600 million years different. So they can't even get the different methods that are used to measure the same things to agree. So depending on what answer you want, you know what lab you want to send it to in order to get the kind of answer that you're looking for. That's bias in the worst way. So based on radioactive dating, the Kaibab Rim of the Grand Canyon has 225 million years missing. There's a whole layer of rock that's missing on one side of the Grand Canyon as compared to the other. No explanations from science there. So let's talk about the moon. So they dated moon rocks and compared it to moon dust. Now the idea is that the dust is just crushed down version of the same rock, right? So the dust and the rocks should be the same age to figure out how old the moon is. So soil samples were taken and the soil was 1 billion years older than the rocks. But the soil was supposed to come from
So
the
the
rocks.
soil made the rocks.
So let's just ignore that. Let's talk about molten lava. Okay, so molten lava we know is rock that just got melted down and then it cools off to become the same rock again.
Right.
Okay. Lava flows from the Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, deposited 197 years ago, were dated from 0 to 1 million years old.
Mhm.
But where they came from is supposed to be 4.5 million years old. But it's the
So
same rock.
It's the same rock, but okay, I got you.
So why do you think it's less? It melted and the stuff came out that they measured. Seals. In one of the most recent cases of wrong dating, rock paintings found in the South African bush in 1991 were analyzed by Oxford University's radiocarbon accelerator unit, who dated them as being around 1,200 years old. So they dated the ink staining
Mhm.
in the caves. The finding was significant because it meant that the paintings would have been the first Bushman painting found in open country. However, publicity of the find attracted the attention of Mrs. Joan Ahrens, a Cape Town, Africa resident, who recognized the paintings as being produced by her at an art class and later stolen from her garden by vandals.
What?
She made the rock painting and it was in her garden. Somebody stole it and found its way into this cave.
And they dated.
They
it
dated the
1200
rock
years
as,
old.
as they dated the ink as being 1,200 years old. And it was her lost drawing.
I don't remember here seeing that on the news.
No. So the significance of incidents such as these is that mistakes can be uncovered only in those rare cases where chance grants us some external methods of checking against something that we actually know to be true. So we need to talk about these seals. So we've got a seal skin in the upper right-hand picture there. And that seal skin was dated. It was known to have been removed from the seal in the 1930s.
Okay.
And it was dated by carbon-14 dating to be 3,000 years old. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think seals live to be 3,000 years old.
I don't think so, not now.
So what does that tell you about carbon-14 dating?
It's off by a lot.
It's off by a lot as well. So investigated why radiometric dating always gives millions or billions of years. The helium content was determined in zircons with a lead uranium ratio that give a radiometric date of 1.5 million years old. I'm going to show you a picture of zircons here in a minute. Little, if any, helium would be expected in the zircons, since this light, tiny, and unreactive element cannot be contained in rock for long periods of time. Helium is so small, it'll just come through the microscopic pores of the rock. That's how small helium is. So helium that would come from this radioactive decay of uranium can't stay in the rock. It can't stay that long. It's too small. So here's some zircons, okay? Cubic zirconia is a type of zircon. So different gemstones that are made of zirconium silicate. And it's zirconium, silicon, and 4 oxygens that make zirconium silicate. And as they trap different impurities in them, they get different colors. And those different colors then is what makes them valuable as gemstones. So this zirconium silicate is found to have uranium in it that decays down to lead. And the byproduct is helium, which is the second smallest known element. It's only got 2 protons. It's tiny, okay? The only thing smaller is hydrogen. So the abundance of the helium in the zircons indicate that the date of the rock is only between 6 and 14,000 years old. This implies that decay rates aren't consistent, and during creation week, they were faster. So before the fall and before the flood, the rates of everything was different. We know that the rate of combustion, the rate of changing food into energy combustion is different because of different amounts of oxygen that would be present. So remember when we talked about the vapor canopy around the earth, the water that would be pushing down on the atmosphere, it would make the air pressures different. It would increase the amount of oxygen and greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being one of them, in the atmosphere, which would speed up metabolic processes, the rate of breaking down things into daughter things. So faster rates would be present before the flood, not only in growth of animals, but also in these chemical processes of radioactive decay. All of those processes would be sped up. So radiocarbon, carbon-14 was detected in coal, oil, and gas samples, supposedly millions of years old. The problem with that is that carbon-14 only has a half-life of 5,730 years, and it's undetectable after 250,000 years, according to the math. So how can you say that it was millions of years old if it still has carbon-14 in it?
Right.
And all the carbon-14 is gone after 250,000 years. Carbon-14 was also measured in 5 samples of diamond to believe at least 1 billion years old. So one dating method says that this diamond is 1 billion years old. Carbon-14 still shows carbon in it. Can't be.
Maybe you should hold this class for the scientists.
Well,
They know it too.
I was
I
gonna
know.
say, how are they, how are they publishing these results when they know for a fact that that cannot be true?
Okay, you just finished a statistics class. What happens if you have a data set and you've got points that lay outside the data range?
They're called outliers.
Outliers, and what do you do with the outliers? Throw them out.
Make it look good for what you.
It's all, yeah, it's all about what they want it to
That's
say.
exactly right. And that is acceptable science.
That's wrong.
That's why I knew it was safe to ask you the question.
That's all I heard about graduate statistics.
So there's other clocking mechanisms that we can use besides radiometric dating, Okay, so let's throw that out. Let's ignore that one. That obviously doesn't work for us. So the exit of gases in the atmosphere, the influx of minerals into the ocean, the buildup of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, and population statistics. So I'm just going to zip through all of these.
Yeah, okay.
They all are wrong. They all don't work. The age of the atmosphere, the rate that helium is introduced or produced and captured by the atmosphere is faster than the rate that it can escape. That's just one thing that we know. Helium is produced faster than it can escape from our atmosphere. Given these conditions, if the Earth were millions or billions of years old, there would be so much helium in our air that we would all talk like chipmunks
But that's when.
if we were filled with helium.
But that's when the ozone layer opens up and stuff.
We're too dense for that. Okay, the amount of salt in the ocean. We've got salt that is being leached out of our soil with rainfall and things like that going into springs and rivers and then going into the ocean. The amount that the salt is going into the ocean would have already saturated the ocean, and all of our oceans would be like the Great Salt Lake, and we would have maximum salinity. There's still plenty of room for salt in our oceans. So if the Earth was billions of years old,
Don't they have like about 4,000 years of sediment under the Mississippi and 4,000 years of sediment? Under
yeah, I didn't even talk about that one in here, but yeah, you could measure the sediment and see that there's only 4,000 years worth of sediment in the Gulf of Mexico. That would be the time since the flood.
Who measured that? And what did they use to measure?
When they drill for oil, that's part of the core samples. It's easily read, but it's ignored.
Yeah, they are.
Yep. When we talk about all of the different minerals, there's plenty of minerals that you can measure, and you can't even compare them to each other because they're all different. You would think by using this method that it would show that there's the same number of years worth of minerals, right?
Same number of years supposed to be there.
Yep. So it's not even close. Nickel, there's only 18,000 years. Lead, there's only 2,000 years. But we've got potassium's got 11 million years, and sodium's got 260 million years. But it all came from the same ground. So this can't even work using the science. So carbon-14. Carbon-14 is a radioactive type of carbon that decays to turn into just regular carbon. Since all life is made of carbon, we've right now inside of you've got regular carbon-12, but you also got carbon-14. It's just in you, it's everywhere. So if you can measure the amount of carbon-12 and carbon-14 and compare it in something that is 55 years old, then you should be able to take something that's been dead for 100 years and you'd get it to be 100 years old. And something that's been dead for 1,000 years and get it to be 1,000 years old. That's the idea. But we've already shown
Doesn't work.
it don't work. It doesn't work. Again, not only because of the decay not being constant, but the amount of carbon-14 prior to the flood is different than it is today after the flood because of the different atmospheric and pressure conditions that we're under and temperatures. Okay, so you can measure the magnetic field. The magnetic field half-life is about 1,400 years. You can actually dig under the seas in these core samples, and you can find different rock samples that show all of the lineups of the magnetic poles in the soil samples. They shift about every 4,000 years. North Pole, South Pole, North Pole, South Pole. All these different layers, they show a shifting of the magnetic field. How do you explain that? Well, you either have to say, well, the Earth just decides to switch every once in a while, or God created it that way for a specific purpose that we still don't quite know. Balance. Population dynamics, let's jump to that one. based on the growth of our population, you can actually run back time based on the growth of our population and mathematically prove that our current population can be traced back to one couple living about 4000 BC.
Cool.
Those numbers don't lie. And who is that couple? Mr. and Mrs. Noah.
Oh,
It's about the right time frame.
that's crazy.
So now we can talk about some big outliers that science doesn't like to talk about. So during the volcanic building of the island of Surtsey, which began in the Atlantic Ocean in 1964, and the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington in the early 1980s. So with these things, we've got black sand beaches formed from the lava within 2 months, and rocks formed from the ash in just a few weeks.
I mean, like rock.
Rock.
Kind of rock.
Yep, rock.
Rock.
And then soil forming from the ash in 5 years, and abundant plant life within 7. And animals starting to populate within 10.
Is this Surtsey?
That's Surtsey. When we talk about Mount St. Helens, that's what it looked like before the 1980 eruption. Then it blew its top,
It did.
blew the whole top off of it. And it really caused a huge problem. Blew every tree on the mountain down into the lake. So we've got a boat in the middle there. That's a
There's
pretty
a
big
boat?
boat. But this is a log jam. It just totally filled the lake with these logs.
Wow.
The bark rubbed off of the trees as they were floating in Spirit Lake, accumulated on the lake bottom, and they had since been covered in mud and ash deposits. Samples collected by divers just 5 years after the eruption showed that they already started turning into petroleum products. We were starting to get the lignite coal being formed in just 5 years. It didn't take millions of years of dinosaurs to turn into it. The tree trunks in the lake, they became saturated with water, and the heavier root ball then swung down, making the tree float erect in the water. And then as the mud settled on top of it, we've got layers of different soils that have now layered on this tree. The tree has started to petrify, the trees down there. And it kind of looks like that tree was growing up through billions of years of rock. But because of the pressures under the water and all of the sediment going down, it's creating the stratification, the different layers, like you see laid down in the Grand Canyon. Different
I think it's
kinds
pretty
of rocks.
laughable about all this. I mean, like just the fact that all these scientists think or whatever, they have everything figured out, and then all this stuff is just kind of blowing it all out.
Yes.
It is.
This is an outlier.
But
They're not
most,
paying
and
attention.
Yeah, I know,
that's
I
the
know,
thing.
I know.
There's not enough data for them to say, oh, this must be how it actually is.
Yeah.
They've collected so much data under the false assumptions for so many years that they can't recognize the truth.
So we need to have a lot more volcanoes go off in the middle of nowhere and have life. in 2
But
years.
anytime a scientist comes out and says, I found this evidence that shows this, they get laughed
They
at by
do.
the scientific
Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
Their articles don't get published
Mhm.
and they get blackballed.
Or they have to make their own, what's that dinosaur park up there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Toutle River Canyon was formed when the river cut through a mudslide caused by the eruption. Okay, this is Mount St. Helens still. The canyon's over 100 feet deep in its deepest point.
Whoa.
It has layering that's comparable to the Grand Canyon, and it's 160th the size of the Grand Canyon, but it formed in 1 day.
What?
Now imagine if you had a whole year's worth of rain running. How dig of a how deep of a cavern would that dig?
Wow.
So from Genesis 5, from Adam to the flood, it's 1,656 years. From Genesis 11's account, it's about 1,500 years. Genesis 11, the flood to Abraham, is 360 years. And then Abraham to Christ is 2,000 years.
Mhm.
And then from Christ to today is roughly 2,000 years. So from Adam to today, based on the genealogies, it should be about 7,550,
So less than 10,000.
less than 10,000 years old. Evolution is a backdoor attempt of saying that all of this is wrong.
I don't think it's back door. I think it's front door.
It's an assault on the lineage of Christ.
Mhm.
So some people try to compartmentalize it and say, well, that's not religion, so I don't need to talk about it. No, it's important because it's an attack on scripture. And it's an attack on the truths of the gospel. So those who believe in an earth that is billions of years old, look at the fossil record with its death, mutations, disease, suffering, bloodshed, and violence that conclude that God, any God responsible for this seeming mess of life and death could not be an all-powerful, all-knowing, and loving God. Right? So much death. That can't be God. So there is no God. Carl Sagan says, I personally cannot discern a shred of evidence for a benign cosmic presence. I see indifference and capriciousness. What kind of God works with a 99.9% extinction rate? He's making his observations with the wrong set of standards. Christians who believe in an earth billions of years old need to come to grips with the real nature of God and the old earth. An old earth God is not the loving God of the Bible. Too much death, too much destruction before sin entered the world.
Mhm.
In order to be a Bible-believing Christian that believes from Genesis to Revelation, you've got to accept a young earth because it makes God too evil if you don't.
Does that make Satan's fall in the Garden of Eden?
So we don't know when that happened. We know that by the time Isaiah writes about, oh, morning star, how you have fallen and all of that, we do know that it was something that's written in scripture, but we don't know when it was. And we could only assume that that happened when God cursed Satan.
Right.
We can only assume that it happened at the fall.
Right.
And that gave Satan reign over the earth during this time. So,
Yeah, I've heard two different schools of thought on that.
yeah, of course, the gap theory, they say it happened
Right.
between Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:2, but that doesn't work because that means the demons would have all gotten destroyed when God remade the heavens and the earth. So we have a problem there too. It's one of those things that we just don't have enough information to say for sure, one way or the other.
Yeah, I heard the other argument too, that there were people on the earth before Adam and Eve. There's no evidence of that.
Right, that's part of the
You can't
gap
prove
theory.
it one way or the other.
Those that believe in the gap theory think that that's where caveman came from and all of the Neanderthals and all of the fossil records of the missing links and stuff. Doesn't work. All right, so we're taking a big shift in the way things look next week. We'll be talking specifically at the fall of man in Genesis 3. So I'm going to stop there. I think we're out of time anyway today.
Yeah, it's like 10:30.
Really?
Really?
Wow. Okay,
Give us a soapbox.
that's all I got. Sorry about going long. Yes. Yeah, everything's on the YouTube channel for the church. Okay.
Not all of us.
Yeah, I'm actually going to, I'm going to expand Steve's notes a bit on the fall. There's things that I want to talk about that he didn't address probably for time's sake. But since I'm making a whole lesson just on the fall, I'll be able to expand it.
Hey. You say that every time.
Yeah, you know how it is.